So welcome to week 1 of Communicating Across Differences. We're so glad you're here. My name is Amanda Sandhop and I'll be your host for this series. Before we get started, I have an important announcement to share. We are currently recruiting for class 44 of our Premier Leadership Development Program for Ag Forestry. As a member of the class, or the current class, class 42, most class ever, in this program, I can tell you that it has helped me tremendously and hope you will consider applying for the opportunity. New this year, we are holding Q&A sessions for applicants. Attendance at one of the sessions is a requirement to your application. We are currently accepting applications and they are due April 30th. You can learn more at agforestry.org/programs. And then the reason why you're all here, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Caitlin Bletcher. Dr. Caitlin Bletcher is an assistant professor of community development at WSU Vancouver in departments of human development and crop soil sciences. She is passionate about equipping students, faculty, and working professionals with leadership power skills to better interact and communication across differences and cultures. Before I hand it over to Caitlin, let's review questions etiquette for the session. Please use the Q&A function located along the bottom or the side of your screen to submit questions. And you can ask questions at any time throughout the presentation. Caitlin's going to be looking over them and she will reply as they come in. And then we're also going to have some time for questions at the end. So if you want to hold other questions or larger questions, there is going to be a Q&A portion at the end. With that, I'll hand it over to Caitlin, and thank you again for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, so much. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited to be here with all of you on a Wednesday morning, at least for those of us that are in Pacific Standard Time. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation here. Excellent. As with all wonderful functioning of webinars and technology, we had a little bit of troubles this morning, so that's why you'll see me duplicated here on the webinar. I'm sharing with a different computer. So if you see me looking down, I'm here with you, I'm engaged, but I'll just be kind of switching through the slides there. Excellent. Well, welcome. Again, that was a wonderful introduction, Amanda. I really appreciate it. I actually see a couple of names that I'm familiar with on these attendees today. We've got just about 50 of us here on the call, and so I really appreciate your time being here today. And over the next 3 weeks, I look forward to connecting with all of you, and I hope that you take some really great nuggets of wisdom and information away for all of you to be most successful in the people that you work with. So let me tell you just a little bit about who I am. Amanda gave a really great introduction, but just a little bit more about myself. So like she mentioned, I am a Washington State University professor on our Vancouver campus, and I see a couple of WSU folks in the chat there, so go Cougs. I am in the Department of Human Development, which will be fairly important as we start off our conversation and continue over the next 3 weeks. I'll be bringing some of that knowledge and background into our conversations. A big part of my life, both research and teaching as well, has really come from my work in agricultural extension. I've done work with extension in ag internationally as well as domestically. I've done that at the university level here at Wazoo, but also I've done that at University of Florida. I've also worked with the Department of State as well as in the nonprofit and international NGO fields as well. A lot of my international agricultural development work actually started in the country of Haiti. So that's that right middle photo that you'll see there. That's in rural North Cap Haitian, working with agrarian community members. But I transitioned a lot to working more domestically for several years in the state of Florida, University of Florida Extension. That's that bottom right-hand kind of photo there. I was working with Burmese refugees in Jacksonville, Florida, with several different community gardens. that were in that city. But now a lot of my research, teaching, and extension is all about community development. So how do we build on the strengths of our community, as well as identify some of the problems and issues that the community is facing by really making sure that all community voices are heard in that process. That's kind of that upper right-hand corner, working with Congolese refugees, talking about access and knowledge with extension, cooperative extension services and resources. So I really love talking about the complexities and the challenges and opportunities of working across difference when we're talking about a wide range of different members of the community. So that top left picture is my work at the Community Development Society, which is an organization of community development practitioners. So before academia, I was working in the nonprofit and governmental sectors. We had about 37 different language dialects and about 28 different countries represented of the colleagues and coworkers that I worked with on the day-to-day. And I want to just humbly acknowledge that my communication was not effective every single day. Every single day was a learning curve. I learned something new about myself, my colleagues, and what that kind of communication dynamic looked like. And so thinking about that part of my life, as well as what that looks like today at Wazoo, at Washington State University, I might not come across as many language dialects and colleagues as well from quite as many different countries. But I really do come across a lot of difference. And in fact, many days I find that it's significantly more challenging to have effective communication across difference at the university than it is at other places that I've worked. So I want to just acknowledge, I know a lot of you might not, but maybe some of you be working with colleagues, on an international sense across, different countries. But all of us and all of you are working across differences in background, how we grew up, ways of perceiving the world around us, how we communicate, how we tend to show up at work and in different workplaces. What we look like when we're stressed out and super anxious, what really kind of winds us up and riles us up. All of these things are different ways of expressing across difference, and us learning how to navigate and communicate effectively in those spaces is really challenging at times. So I really love working with college students. That's that bottom left-hand corner, although this student, she's a crop and soil student, has since graduated and works in the ag industry in Wisconsin. But I'm really thrilled to be here today working with and communicating with all of you and having a discussion with adult learners. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm really excited to be here. All right, this is enough talking at you for now, although there is going to be quite a bit of that with this webinar, just simply due to the nature of the platform that we're using. But I would love to learn a little bit about all of you, especially, as it relates to the topic that we're going to be discussing over the course of the next 3 weeks with this webinar series, which is effective communication across difference and in conflict. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions about how you personally navigate conflict. You can feel free to use the reaction buttons on Zoom. So that's located on the bottom of your Zoom screen there. You'll be able to see hopefully a little reactions button. It has a smiley face with a little plus sign on it. To be able to kind of engage in this activity, just to make it a little bit interactive if you're able to. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask that you use the reaction signs based off of the, we've got some hands raised. Excellent. Maybe perhaps it's a hand raised. Maybe we weren't able to get the reaction button. Let's see. If you're able to use a reaction button, go ahead and place that reaction button now. Oh, bummer, no reactions. Thank you to Erica, Kyle, Catherine, etc. for being able to use to let me know about that reaction button. Bummer. That's okay, no problem. Go ahead and into the chat, Rosa, yes, absolutely. I love the makeshift in the chat. Go ahead and head to the chat. And what I'm going to ask is, thanks, Bernadita, is you can go ahead and either under the chat, there's going to be a little smiley face icon there. And you can click on that smiley face and you can search for these icons. You can also add your own. You can also type into the chat yourself in terms of if you say never, and you can press enter, seldom, sometimes, frequently, or always. This is the joy of effective communication, is being adaptive and flexible in the moment. So I'll ask you a series of questions, and you can either include your reaction or your icon and little smiley face on the chat, or you can type that into the chat using the actual word semantics as well. So here's my first question for all of you. How often do you get into arguments with others in the workplace? Doesn't have to be huge, but how often do you get into arguments with others in the workplace? Never, seldom, sometimes, frequently, or always? We got a lot of seldoms on here. All right. And some never. Excellent, Adam. Sometimes question mark, possibly. Excellent. All right. All right. Next question. How often do you stay calm when you're in a conflict that's getting heated at work? So emotions are getting high, people are starting to get angry. How often do you stay calm when you're in conflict, when it's getting heated at work? We've got sometimes, seldom, most of the time. I like that. Frequently. All right. Excellent. Great. I love the additional icons that are being used. All right. During this webinar, we're going to be talking about how to effectively communicate, especially when those emotions are high. So especially when things start to get heated, whether that's you or perhaps the emotions in others that maybe are causing you to get those emotions to be higher. We're going to talk about that. All right, next question. This might apply for some of you, while not in others. How often do you feel like you're passive aggressive in conflict at work? How often are you passive aggressive in your conflict at work? This could be perhaps with email conversations. This could be face-to-face. Okay. Interesting. We've got a whole range. Okay. All right. So for those of you, excellent. Thanks, Sarah. I try hard not to. For those of you that maybe are in the never, seldom kind of category, how often do you avoid conflict at work? How often do you intentionally avoid conflict at work? How often do you avoid conflict at work? Ooh, okay. Excellent. We've got a range here as well, but have a lot more engagement with avoidance perhaps than passive aggressive. Excellent. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for participating. So thinking about this, I asked all of you in terms of what this looks like in the workplace. So how often you get into arguments, staying calm when things get heated, being passive aggressive, avoiding conflict. I maybe even taking comments personally. A lot of what this webinar is going to be about is really being reflective of how we show up in conflict, specifically as it relates to the workplace with other professionals. But a lot of this, which we'll start talking about today, comes from a place that's very personal. So as you're answering some of these questions, I want you to think also about how this shows up in your home, how this shows up with your family unit, your partner, your family members. Thinking about how often do you take comments personally at home? How often do you get into arguments at home, even if they're not huge arguments? How often do you stay calm? How often are you passive aggressive and avoid conflict? So it's thinking about some of these questions too, not just in the workplace, but also how that might look different, your behaviors and your interactions to others, how that might look different in different spaces. All right, so let's, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit about thinking about how well we do certain things when we are in conflict. A lot of our conversation over the next 3 weeks is going to be about skill development. I'm going to provide you not only with that self-reflection piece for us to get started to think about how we show up when we're in conflict, but also some very specific strategies and skills to be able to navigate conflict successfully across differences. So we're going to start from this place of how well we are doing in these areas. So first question, and again, you can feel free to use the icon, word choices, and some of you are using your own words too, which is great. I love it. First question, how well do you resolve issues in your team for work? So how well do you feel like you resolve issues in your team at work? Thanks, Tim. I appreciate the wide range. Excellent. All right, great. We've got a lot of well, very well, somewhat well. Excellent. So we've got some tools and some strategies already. Great. Excellent. Next question. How well do you feel like you navigate conflict when the person that you're working with is clearly very angry or upset? How well do you feel like you navigate conflict when that other person that you're in conflict with is clearly very angry or upset? All right. We've got some somewhat and not so wells. Excellent. I appreciate all the honesty here. Excellent. Absolutely. Yeah, emotions create different obstacles in terms of listening, in terms of effective communication. So we're going to talk about some different strategies for that as well this over the next couple of weeks. Next question. How well do you mediate when there's two coworkers or two colleagues that aren't getting along well? So maybe you're not in the conflict, but how well do you mediate when there's two coworkers or colleagues that are not getting along well, when there's conflict between them? Excellent. We've got all across the board. Adam, not my problem. Depends. Absolutely, Bernadita. A lot of what we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks is going to be very contextual to your workplace environment. And so I would encourage all of us, as we're talking about some of these different strategies and some of this reflection work, to really think through, how might this apply to me specifically in my role and in my workplace? All right. Excellent. Thank you for participating. Last question. How well do you handle customer or client complaints? How well do you handle customer or client complaints? All right. We've got a lot of very wells, somewhat wells, and an extremely well, but later vent to my husband. Absolutely. Excellent. Listening and trying to be empathetic. I see already some strategies for effective communication, especially with complaints. Great. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I really appreciate it. That's going to be kind of part of this webinar series. Is I hope that there's going to be a little bit of interaction, both using the chat and questions, as well as we're going to have the opportunity to hear from a couple of your peers in this series, as well as we go through different reflection and strategies. And so we'll be able to hear from others and not just me throughout the next couple of weeks. So thank you. All right, Amanda did a really good job at kind of going through some of the community standards, is what I like to call them, but just different ways that we can all function most successfully given this particular platform. So I'd love to go over just a couple of those today as we get started for the kind of setting a foundation for the next several weeks. So the first and foremost, please take care of your own immediate needs. So bio breaks, if you need to get up and stretch and move your body, head outside for some fresh air, whatever you need to do, please feel free to do that. Get up and grab a cup of water or cup of coffee, please do so. And for those of you that are tuning in remotely outside of your workplace, please feel free to attend to whatever immediate needs require your attention. So that could be kiddos, it could be family members, your partner, maybe furry friends as well that you have in the house. Please feel free to take care of those immediate needs. Next is to be engaged, but not distracting. So similar to the exercise that we just did, I'm going to ask for a little bit of participation during these webinar series. And we're going to continue to do that, like I mentioned, as well as kind of some participant spotlights of your peers and colleagues that are on the call with us. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, I would say a couple of things. One, feel free to jot those down on a spare piece of paper or your participant notebook, which I'll talk about in a moment here. And if you have any questions that you feel like are fairly meaningful and would be helpful to clarify with the entire group, you can feel free to put those in the question and answers. Or like I said, we'll have some time at the end of all three of these webinars. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is building on each other. And so a lot of times questions that you have now might be answered towards the end. But there is a time dedicated after the third webinar to be able to answer any questions. But in the moment, if something really is drawing you and you think it would benefit everybody to hear more, you can please feel free to put that into the chat. I'm going to ask that with that though, no side conversations in the chat. For anybody who's ever hosted any type of meeting on Zoom, we all know what distracting chat comments look like, and it almost is like if we were all here in person together and we have a lot of side conversation, it's just a little bit distracting. So let's all try to kind of engage in the chat into what its purpose is for question and answers. Seek first to understand, not to be understood. If anybody likes Stephen Covey, maybe this might be familiar to you. We're going to be having, like I mentioned, several participants share out. Your colleagues familiar or maybe new are going to be sharing their own perspectives and reflections during our time together. So during that moment in that time, I would say, seek first to understand differing perspectives and differing ways of seeing things and points of views, even if those might differ from your own. And that is the whole purpose of this webinar. It takes a lot of courage to share in front of this kind of Zoom room full of participants. So let's give them the respect during that time that they deserve. I also have a Vegas rule. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, similar to what happens in our webinar stays in this webinar. So the stories, especially that are shared by our participant spotlights, that is their story to share. So you can feel free to share your own story with others outside of this time that we have together. But for those that are shared here, let's keep those in here, please. Being fully present, being here with us to the best of your ability. This is really challenging to do in a webinar series, and I completely recognize that. I'm going to ask for those of you that got a chance to take a look at our participant workbook to go ahead and stick with us during this time together. So please don't work ahead. A lot of what we're going to be talking about in real time is going to apply to the specifics of the workbook. So don't skip ahead. Engage in this time. We don't get many chances really in the workplace to be able to dedicate 1 hour for personal development and reflection. And so you'll get out of this what you put into it. And so please engage again to the best of your ability wherever you're at to spend this time to improving your skills and improving your self-awareness and understanding of navigating conflict in the workplace during this time. Part of that being present means coming fully prepared. I am going to give you a couple of very brief homework assignments during our time together. I would encourage you to dive into that if you've got some extra time, even if that just means thinking about it in the shower on Wednesday morning before our webinar. But like I said, the more that you get out of this really correlates with how much you put into it. And so taking some time outside of this 1 hour to really do the work to apply some of what we're talking about and chew on it a little bit more will be really helpful. And then lastly, be curious when something's interesting to you or when something strikes a chord with you, even if you're not really sure where that's coming from, write it down on that piece of paper or write it down on your workbook and continue to think about it. This curiosity is really going to be starting for these first 3 weeks, but I hope that it doesn't end here. And I hope that some of the things that we raise in this series really gets you to continue to think about how this might look or how this might really change some of your workplace environments. All right, so speaking of participant workbook, I believe that Hannah, let me scroll up to the chat, place that into our chat. Excellent. So it is there as well as email to all of you. Like I mentioned, please, if you can help it, try not to rush ahead. During my conversation, I'm going to be kind of expanding a little bit more on beyond what's just written in your notebook. Feel free to take notes. If you want to print it out hard copy, I love doing that and just writing notes in the margin or in the workbook itself. Feel free to do that. It'll be helpful for you as you complete and apply some of this stuff during your homework after following the webinar. I'm also going to ask that everybody choose somebody in your life as somebody to engage with this material outside of your workplace and outside of this program. So maybe it's somebody who you're familiar with as a colleague from another unit, or maybe a colleague that you're close with and want to gain more information or understanding from, or maybe it's a family member at the dinner table at night. But being able to have somebody else to talk about and reflect on this material with can be really helpful. So I would encourage everybody to think about who that might be for you. Lastly, what you'll find in the participant workbook is there are a lot of additional resources. I like to talk with my students and say that everything that I do is kind of like a buffet. I would say feel free to try just a little bit of everything from the buffet that I'm going to be offering you over the next 3 weeks. If you like it, come back for more. Feel free to dig into those additional readings, reach out with questions that you might have. And if you don't like it, no problem. You do not have to come back to the buffet and try anymore. But please just note that there's a lot of additional resources in that workbook for you. If you're interested and something strikes some curiosity for you, feel free to dive in there. So a lot of you, like I mentioned, probably got a chance to take a look at that participant workbook and got a chance to kind of take a look at what we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks. If not, feel free to dive into that and feel free to kind of take a look. Oh, thanks, Hannah, for posting that again. Take a look and you can see kind of the summary outline of what we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks. How it'll usually start is we'll have an agenda starting with today about what it is that we're going to be covering. You can also find this on page 5 in our participant workbook as well. We're always going to start with an introduction and an agenda just to get us all on the same page, some type of participative icebreaker kind of to get the juices flowing depending on where we're at. And then I'll always kind of go through this and follow this throughout the webinar. So you can feel free to follow along and know where we're headed on this journey over the next 3 weeks. All right, so let's dive in. Let me tell you just a little bit about why we're even talking about this in the first place. So I had mentioned I'm from the Department of Human Development, and spoiler alert, that might be a helpful kind of thing to know about me because it gives a lot of context and come from in terms of why we're talking about this today and why we're starting today on talking a little bit about self-awareness as it relates to how we approach conflict and some of the emotions that we tend to show, or maybe tend not to show when we're in conflict with others. So as a developmental specialist, a lot of my work I mentioned is in community development, but I also talk about development across the lifespan. That is, usually I get what in the world is human development. And to give a long story short, it is looking at the development, talking about physical, socio-emotional, and psychological development as it happens across different age groups and across different parts of our lives. And so this is an important part when we're talking about working with others, because a lot of how we communicate and interact with people from conflict is very developmental. It actually comes from what we saw growing up. So I'm not going to give you a ton of heady research. If this jazzes you up, feel free to dive into those additional resources. But I am going to give just a little bit of background as we start talking about this today. So first and foremost, conflict. This is an important topic. When I was originally talking to Hannah, she had mentioned that this was an important topic that came from a lot of you, but as well as somebody who is a developmental specialist, I feel like it's also incredibly important, simply because when we're talking about stable and satisfying, mutually satisfying relationships, managing conflict when we're communicating is one of the primary processes that actually determines whether relationships are going to be successful, whether they're going to be stable over time and mutually satisfying. And a lot of these relationships show up in our personal lives. So I mentioned we'll be kind of thinking about family units, friends, as well as in our professional lives and in our workplace. A lot of research shows that, thinking about conflict, and for many of us, I even saw this as we were going through our initial icebreaker, a lot of us perhaps might want really harmonious, wonderful, highly functioning workplaces and teams and relationships, but that just isn't possible. And everything that we know from developmental science and from research on families suggests that conflict is going to happen. Conflict is inevitable. And it's more important really to focus on how you respond specifically to that conflict versus the conflict itself. So it's not realistic or possible or even healthy to expect that, these relationships are going to be harmonious all the time. So I want to first recognize that we all are coming into this webinar with kind of different places and connotations of what conflict looks like. And in fact, if I asked everybody to give me a couple of words of what they believe conflict feels like, or maybe a word that describes conflict, usually I get a lot of negative associations, a lot of negative words about conflict. But I'm hoping that over the next 3 weeks, we can perhaps talk about how successfully and positively navigating through conflict can actually be very constructive in workplaces and in our relationships. So like I mentioned, a way to be able to understand how someone develops certain conflict styles or different conflict preferences for how they navigate and communicate in conflict is really to start thinking about the connection between the individual and their parents' conflict style. And this is especially present with research with primary caregivers. So maybe for you, that was a parental role. Maybe that was somebody else. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe it was an aunt or an uncle, or maybe it was even a mentor, a coach, or an extended family member growing up. But what we saw growing up is really important in how we navigate conflict, because that is how our understanding and processing of conflict, where it's come from. It's come from the households that we grew up in, the communities that we were in, the neighborhoods, the schools, the extended family. All of those people played a role into how we navigate conflict today. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that. So, like I mentioned, the way that we saw our families, as well as different communities that we grew up with, how we saw them handle and resolve conflict and navigate through conflict has been shown in research to be directly linked to not only our communication while in conflict, but also our emotional reactivity, how our emotions show up in conflict, how strong they are, how immediate they are, as well as how we attempt to resolve that conflict as an adult. So a lot of that comes from childhood, or what we call early adolescence. So anywhere between infancy to about 10 or 11 years old. So I'll give you an example. There was a study done that compared children and their maternal figures, so mothers, but also other maternal figures in their lives with growing up as their caretakers. And they found that mothers that were more open to discussions when they were in conflict, their children also appeared to be more open to discussions when in conflict as they grew up. Here's another one. This particular study looked at the influence of family conflict dynamics, both with children, as well as how they grew up into adults, specifically with their partners. So this was a romantic relationship. Some of them were married, others were not. But it was really fascinating to see how we navigate our navigation and perceptions of conflict, specifically within romantic relationships. A lot of that is shaped from what we saw growing up. So in this study, they found that the more positive family atmosphere and experiences that kids had when navigating conflict growing up, they appeared to be less hostile in conflict situations with their romantic partners than those that had negative experiences growing up. There was another study that looked at adult children who experienced negative family dynamics with conflict. And for these individuals, they experience more negative emotional reactivity. So like I mentioned before, this would look like being more irritated more easily and faster, which then led to obviously poor conflict management growing up as an adult. So there's a lot of link and a lot of research. And like I said, dive into that additional resources if this interests you, but shows that there's a very clear link between how we navigate conflict and how we communicate and interact in conflict as adults, and what that looked like growing up specifically with our primary caretakers. So specifically with our parents. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that that might be intergenerational. So the same conflict style that I saw growing up with one or two of my primary caretakers is very similar to the conflict style that I'm going to adopt later on. And in the field of human development, there's this idea called attachment theory, which has been done countless studies to take a look at how my connection and my attachment to that primary person or people growing up, especially in infancy and early childhood, that style of connection and attachment is going to have significant impacts later on in life. And so there was this study that looked at that attachment style, that level of connection. So the behaviors that I show to my caretaker and they show to me, that significantly influences our communication style as adults. And this particular study, it was over the period of about 2 decades. They looked at both in infancy, childhood, and followed those same people later on into adulthood. And they found that this attachment style that these children had to their caretaker, eventually growing up could impact how they communicate their emotions and needs, how they understand emotions and needs specifically of their romantic relationships, how they respond to conflict in terms of behaviors, how they self-regulate with conflict, self-management of both emotions and behaviors when in conflict, as well as it shifted their expectations, the expectations of their relationships and their partners in conflict about how the other person should act, should behave. And it showed up in a lot of places throughout their life. So in the workplace, but also in other relationships within adulthood. So in this question of, why are we talking about this and starting from this particular place, I think it's really important for us to note that when we're thinking about conflict and how we show up, a lot of that is based off of what we saw growing up, positively or negatively, what we experience with behaviors and how emotions were shown. That clouds our expectations for how other people should be or should behave or should interact or should communicate when we interact with them now in adulthood. And so it's important for us to be reflective on that because it gives us a sense of awareness and consciousness of maybe perhaps what our expectations are and why it's so frustrating when those are challenged or those look different when we're interacting with people across differences. They came from a different dynamic growing up, different caretakers, different experiences with adults and navigating through conflict growing up. So that's why we all bring this level of difference when we communicate and interact with each other. And that's why it makes things so much more challenging and why I love to start off this conversation by really thinking about ourselves and thinking about where that conflict came from, where that perception of conflict came from. So what I'm going to ask is we're going to start off with this self-reflection for ourselves. So if you've got that participant notebook, workbook open up, go ahead and navigate to page 6. You can, like I mentioned, type onto that PDF document yourself. You can print it out and type right on it if you'd like to do that as well. Similar to my comments originally, I would encourage all of us to be curious. So starting with this very first individual reflection, there's going to be a couple throughout this webinar series. Let's embrace, the spirit of curiosity to really think about some of the assumptions of how we're viewing conflict, what we're talking about, what good leadership looks like in conflict. Maybe perhaps can we dismiss some of those connotations, those negative connotations that we have of conflict, and really try to embrace and think about and reflect about how we've experienced conflict in the past and how that might show up in our relationships now. So go ahead and on that page 6, spend some time. I'm going to give you about 7-ish minutes to work on this. So I'm going to mute myself so that you have the opportunity to reflect individually, however works best for you. You can even take a picture of this and go for a 7-minute walk outside if you'd like, but take some time to reflect on these questions about what emotions were displayed in your family when there was conflict. What did that look like growing up? Specifically, emotions in terms of behaviors. If I were to put a video camera on your family unit growing up, what would I see? What emotions perhaps were not seen in your family when there was conflict? What behaviors were not present or maybe perhaps discouraged? Which leads into the next question about behaviors and emotions during conflict that were allowed or not allowed. Who continued to perhaps make that rule of what emotions were allowed? And how did you know that that was an allowed emotion to express or an allowed behavior to have while in conflict? And did any of this look different in other spaces? Maybe perhaps you went next door and your neighbor's house and you saw their family interact in conflict, and that was very different. Maybe that looked different in school, elementary school growing up. And then lastly, this is the most important question to spend some time on is how have these emotions impacted how you tend to act? So behave, or perhaps don't behave, disengage, shut down, whatever that might look like when you're in conflict today. So like I mentioned, I'm going to give you about 7 minutes to complete this reflection, and then we're going to get a chance to hear from some of your peers about their responses and their insights gained. Kyle, I saw you head on. I'd love to hear from you. What was an aha moment you had?
Yeah, just to kind of build off of what Jackie has shared, I think at the beginning of your presentation, you highlighted the ways or the studies that show how as a kid or an adolescent, how the families handle conflict have a direct impact on us as individuals. And that just brought back a lot of memories and kind of was a huge aha for me. I'll be the first to say that growing up, I didn't necessarily have the most stable household, and there was always a lot of conflict between my parents, and the way they handled conflict, of course, was very vocal, very loud, very hostile type of conflict. A lot of the times, a lot of feelings were bottled up until they just boiled over, and a lot of escalation. And so I look at that as a direct representation of how I act in my life today is I try to avoid conflict at all costs. And I think that's just because I'm not comfortable with it. I try to hide away from it. And in fact, myself, the way I handle conflict, it takes a lot for me to boil over. But when I do boil over, I come hot-headed very quick and have a loud voice. And just, it's not a good feeling to handle conflict for me. So that's what stood out.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyle, so much. I really appreciate that perspective. Thinking through how maybe perhaps some of the discomfort that we felt growing up when we saw our parents engage in conflict can definitely play a role in how we navigate conflict today. And perhaps for some of you, maybe you did not see conflict overtly growing up. Maybe perhaps when your parents or caregivers had a conflict, they put you in a different room, or they closed the door, or they talked in their room, or whatever that might be. And so maybe now as an adult, you don't necessarily have the language or know what emotions to share or have had a challenging time learning how to navigate through conflict because you didn't see that positively or negatively shown in your household. Thank you so much again, both Jackie and Kyle. I really appreciate you sharing your insights and perspectives. This is a phenomenal opportunity for all of you to not only hear from these two examples, but to bring this to other people in your life and ask similar questions to start seeing some of those differences that might be present among how we saw conflict show up differently in our households. And for some of you with that question about did conflict look differently among different members of your family? For those of you with siblings, how did gender roles play a role in this? There's a ton of research, and I put an article in there in the participant workbook, but there's a ton of research out there on gender roles and how the impact of gender in navigating conflict as a child. Maybe some of you have kind of heard the stereotype comment that's usually raised in these conversations of be a man, dust it off, or no, you skinned your knee. We don't cry. Men don't cry, right? How is that reinforced differently with different genders? And in fact, a lot of research suggests that young children, young boys and girls respond differently to conflict growing up that's being reinforced by their family unit and primary caregivers. And this leads to women at greater risk of emotional problems and issues within conflict, and men as adults with greater risk of behavioral problems in adulthood with conflict. So think about that too, about how that showed up in different gender roles and in different members of your family. Tim, that is an excellent comment, and I really appreciate you putting in the chat. And it's a great segue to what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this webinar, which is the fact that all of us experience emotions. And in fact, we're going to be talking about this, spoiler alert, in the third webinar series about where that comes from. But it's a very biological response. So we don't necessarily have a choice in whether or not we're going to experience emotion, but we do have a choice in how we respond versus some of these automatic reactions. So thank you, Tim, for that segue. So I'm going to talk just briefly about this. Like I said, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert for what we're going to be talking about in the next 2 weeks, but we're just going to briefly discuss this now. So when there's a stimulus, a person or a situation, scenario that's causing a conflict, in this particular case that we're talking about, we can instinctually act on our emotions. This is what I like to call behavioral tendencies, how we tend to behave when we are in conflict. We can act without even being intentional or even aware of it. A lot of you have probably heard about fight, flight, or freeze mentality. So in conflict, we get especially hostile. Maybe we raise our voice. Maybe we get a little bit harsh with our word choices. Flight, maybe we avoid entirely, leave the situation. Or freeze, maybe we shut down, disengage from the conversation entirely. So in times when this stimulus happens, and I hope that over the next 3 weeks, we can start getting some of these strategies to where choice can come in. Effective communication when we're in conflict across difference, and especially when those emotions are high for yourself or for others that you're working with, means knowing that you have a certain emotion and yet taking a couple of seconds of pause to be able to choose your response versus have that automatic, instinctual, comfortable reaction. So stimulus, whatever is causing that conflict, it creates changes in our emotions, and sometimes, again, really strong emotions. And yet choice can still occur in that moment. You can respond proactively. So this might be taking a moment to pause and to say, hey, let's revisit this in a moment when we're both calmed down. This could look like asking questions, maybe remaining open to different perspectives, different experiences that this other person has had, different experiences growing up that this other person has had. So you still feel that emotion, right? It doesn't get rid of all of these strong feelings of anger, frustration, annoyance, maybe even apathy, right? But it still allows us to choose and act in a different way. So choice is really the difference between living on this kind of reactionary autopilot when we're reactionary in conflict and usually not the best communicators. So it's the difference between that and living intentionally, which I would say is living in alignment with a leadership perspective, really leading others and working constructively with others in the workplace, showing up how we want and choose to show up in our interactions with others versus just reacting based off of the strong emotion, or maybe reacting based off of how we've seen it growing up, or what is most comfortable for us, instead meeting other people where they're at. So again, this is just the starting point. I hope this has gotten you a little bit intrigued for the next 3 weeks. I want to mention that quote above. I really, really love and admire Dr. Susan David. That's actually a colleague of mine. Dr. David is an award-winning Harvard Medical School psychologist. She's from South Africa, and she's someone that we'll be drawing from a lot with our conversations for this series, especially when we talk about emotional agility. Third webinar series, spoiler alert. But for Dr. David, leadership is all about how our thoughts, emotions, and all of our motives can either empower or derail us when we're working with others effectively. So phenomenal resources for Dr. David. You can check out susandavid.com as well for a lot of resources, but we'll be drawing from her work consistently throughout the webinar series. I mentioned that homework. So a couple of things. One, if you want to spend some more time on that individual reflection, please feel free to do so. Take some time to really dive into some of those questions, as well as take this outside of the webinar series. So take this to a colleague that you have a relationship with and would like to learn about them a little bit more. Take this to your partner at the dinner table, whoever that might be. And go ahead and ask them some of these questions. And in fact, I give you a couple of prompts there on your workbook on page 7 to talk about similarities and differences of how you saw conflict growing up, and also maybe how that shows up in your own relationship and how that might be different from one another. So the whole purpose of this is to really see that all of us approach conflict differently. And part of the reason for that is based off of our experiences growing up. And last but not least, there is an assessment that we're going to be talking about for our second webinar series. So make sure to take a look at that as well. That is going to be at the end following our homework in your participant workbook. Complete that assessment so that we can come prepared for next Wednesday's conversation about that assessment called the TKI, the Thomas Kilmann instrument, to learn a little bit about your own conflict style when in communication. Thank you so much, Amanda. I give it back to you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Caitlin, or Dr. Fletcher, for starting us on this journey today. If there are any unanswered questions, we will forward them to Caitlin so we can ensure to cover them next week. But as Dr. Fletcher has said, that we are going to be building on this for the next couple of weeks. So if there are unanswered questions, she may answer them in the next session or the session afterwards. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely week.